Hello, Foreign Entanglements viewers, and welcome to the first Foreign Entanglements of the age of Trump. Not exactly the first Trump administration, but it is our first episode after the election. My name is Rob Farley. I work at the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce at the University of Kentucky, and with me today is a frequent contributor to Foreign Entanglements, Dan Nexon. How are you doing today, Dan?
As well as could be expected.
The first thing we're talking about, and what everybody's talking about right now in terms of foreign policy and what a Trump administration foreign policy is going to look like, is sort of literally who the people who are going to staff the Trump administration are. And there are two questions associated with this, and I know you've been following it. The one question is who literally will be the people in there, and we have only tea leaves at this point. And the second, which has been brought up by a lot of people, are what kind of ethical obligations do people have with respect to serving in this administration, right? Despite whether they, all the way from the very top policymaking level down to the levels that are more associated with sort of the day-to-day interaction of foreign policy. So, starting with either of those, what are you seeing right now coming together in the Trump administration?
Well, it's chaos, right? I mean, we get different reports every hour, and as of right now, 9:15 a.m. on Wednesday morning, it looks like we're seeing a pattern where each rung of people who would be competent and help to keep the Trump administration on a reasonable course get shunted aside or appear to be not really in consideration. Mm-hmm. And so we move down from, A-list people I disagree with, to B-list people I disagree with, to C-list people who start to get scary, to D-list people who should really terrify us, right? One of the worst, I think, pieces of news out of yesterday was that Frank Gaffney had been put on the transition team, who is, I don't think we're supposed to say this in polite foreign policy circles, but is a lunatic.
Right.
Somebody who thinks that EMP, electromagnetic pulses, are a huge threat to our security. Somebody who has particularly been riding the stealth Sharia wave, that is, thinks that there are Islamicist plots within to impose Sharia law on the United States.
He's called for a thoroughgoing purge of the existing professional foreign policy and intelligence community bureaucracy.
Right, and it's helpful to remember this is somebody who was in the late '80s is on record as arguing that Gorbachev's perestroika and glasnost policies were attempts to lull the West into a false sense of security so that the Soviet Union could be a leaner, meaner fighting machine and attack the United States. This is not somebody who is, shall we say, hinged in his views of foreign policy, not somebody who's been borne out at any given period in terms of his views.
No, in fact, he was cast out not simply by sort of movement conservatism writ large, but by the specific foreign policy people who he would, in some cases, be most associated with, right? By the people he tries to associate with, right? I mean, the neoconservatives consider him to be exactly like you just said, a full-on lunatic. And he's finding his way into this administration.
Right. And we should draw distinctions here. It is possible to believe that the primary contradiction of the world system right now is the struggle between something called civilization and radical jihadism, or whatever you want to call it. Right? It's perfectly possible to believe that and believe that from a perspective of sanity and competency. Right? It is not completely irrational to say, look, the best situation for our security would be to make deals with autocratic regimes to tamp down on transnational violence, right? I don't necessarily agree with it 100%, but it's not a crazy position, right? You can hold that position in crazy ways. And I don't know how to mince words about that, right? You can hold that position in crazy ways. He does.
Right. No, absolutely, fully. And, I mean, so his inclusion is problematic because, again, it does kind of suggest that the very fact that he's included in this suggests to me, and I know you know a few people who are within what we broadly consider this professional foreign policy bureaucracy. I know a few people, right? They are going to consider his inclusion in this transition team as a gigantic red flag with respect to their professional futures, right? I mean, we've been talking about this idea of significant numbers, whether we would go up to the degree of mass, but significant numbers of resignations from major organs of foreign policy in the United States. And the inclusion of Gaffney really in any fashion, to say nothing of John Bolton, who was, as of 9:15 yesterday, supposed to be, and then Rudy Giuliani was for 4 hours or something along those lines. I don't know who the Secretary of State is supposed to be now. But
And I will say here that I'm in the camp that as much as I dislike Bolton and everything he stands for, I would much prefer to have Bolton than Giuliani as Secretary of State.
That's an interesting argument. We had that debate yesterday in one of my classes. So what's your case for Bolton?
Competency,
Mm-hmm.
right? Knowledge,
Mm-hmm.
lack of huge conflicts of interest,
Mm-hmm.
right? Financial conflicts of interest, and some connections into, he may be on what we call the extreme neoconservative wing,
Mm-hmm.
but he's connected into the broader neoconservative wing, and he's
Mm-hmm.
respected in that wing.
Mm-hmm.
That you would expect him to bring on people who would be in his camp, but not necessarily, but have some experience, how to make the ship of state sail.
Right. Now,
To say that is to say,
mm-hmm.
That's not an endorsement of Bolton.
Right.
It's a sign of where we look like we're at right now. Right. I would love somebody like Corker,
Mm-hmm.
right, for example, to come in, but we're just kind of in, what's the phrase we've all been using, uncharted waters.
Now, and this seems like a self-answering question, right? But what is the case against Giuliani's competence, right? So, he was a major city mayor. He was, is he loathed among the professional State Department, like FSOs, more than Bolton is? Because Bolton is deeply loathed by professional FSOs. But Giuliani has been. I mean, he worked in prosecutor's office in New York for a significant amount of time. I can understand your case for Bolton, but what's your case against Giuliani?
So I don't know how Giuliani is perceived in the Foreign Service Corps, in part because I don't think anybody even considered Giuliani as somebody who would be Secretary of State. I mean, we were all, I guess the silver lining would be, well, no, it's not, because maybe we're talking about other people now, but, the big fear initially was he would be Attorney General. Right.
Which would be disastrous in so many ways. Right,
but now he looks like he might be better than some of the people who are being considered. I mean, I think the problem is there's no evidence that he has any significant knowledge or at all about foreign policy.
Anything beyond a set of attitudinal positions that sort of
the attitudinal positions. So on the one hand, the attitudinal positions we saw during the campaign, which were pretty much bomb everybody, 100% support behind Israel, no matter what Israel does, no matter what that means for our broader relationships. And I'm pro-Israel, right? A very much in the kind of the more rhetorically extreme wing of this. We have to destroy radical Islam camp, and doesn't seem to have any kind of the temperament we would expect, right, to be able to engage in what we call diplomacy, which is a very difficult and tricky business. The fact that he was in the primary a hardline anti-Russia type, right, and it seems to have flipped 100%, suggests he has no kind of core convictions or guiding principles, which, I guess you could say that pragmatism is good. We like pragmatism. Right. I like to think you have some articulable worldview of the way that international politics works, other than a list of friends and enemies. And it's true, was... I mean, this is not an endorsement of Bolton, right? Right. Seen as too pugnacious as well, lacking in diplomatics, in the sort of necessary diplomatic savvy. So, I mean, you could make a claim that, better to have somebody we don't know what they're really going to be like, and somebody we know is going to have a lot of negatives. But again, to me, this is not, given everything else about this administration the Secretary of State position is not something you want to throw into the hands of somebody who has
Right.
no competencies that we're aware of.
Right. What I worry about Bolton, and we simply don't know about Giuliani, right? Although one could probably plumb his experience as the mayor of New York with respect to this. What bothers me about Bolton is his sort of raw disdain, and goes so beyond disdain, but almost hatred of sort of the legal aspects of the international order, right? Of international law writ large, right? And of the United Nations, and a variety of other institutions that you and I know feel are guiding lights to the established sort of liberal internationalist order. It's I hate to get into this sort of competence, because I don't want incompetent people, right? But Bolton kind of knows where the bodies are buried with respect to this international order, and he could really hurt it if he wants to, as the Secretary of State.
So there's no evidence, though, that Giuliani is any more favorably disposed to the same things.
Right.
Indeed, his campaign rhetoric suggests he's not at all, right? I mean, he's on we have on tape saying things like it's legal to seize oil,
Right.
during like it was simply not true.
Right.
So I don't know there's any comparative advantage. What I would say is that I don't know the ins and outs of Bolton's views of foreign policy as well as I might. Right, and as well as somebody who would speak more authoritatively to this. Generally speaking, I understand the broad neoconservative impetus as being one that's in favor of sort of global liberalism, right? But sees a lot of the institutions of global liberalism as problematic for that, right? It's not a crazy position, right? If you think that the United States ought to be in the business of overall improving the position of democracy and things like that, and you look at the United Nations, where human rights abusers are on, making decisions about human rights, where authoritarian states have veto power in the UN Security Council, you can kind of say, that you can kind of see how at some point neoconservatives might say this is not actually helpful to us, right? I think this is actually the major distinction between liberal internationalists and neoconservatives, is how much weight they place on the institutional order versus the underlying kind of global liberalization impetus. And liberal internationalists think that the institutional order is much more important, both pragmatically for achieving that, but also in and of itself. I know Bolton has huge antipathy towards the UN, but he's not somebody I'm aware of, and I could be wrong here, who's shown tremendous antipathy towards, say, the very notion that the United States ought to have alliances where it maybe bears some greater share of the burden in order to press security dilemmas, in order to press long-term threats to our security, in order to not have to spend more by having to go it alone in the long term. He's somebody who has certainly not been a dove when it comes to the Russians, to my knowledge.
Right.
And from my perspective, while I actually think that we do need a course correction with Russia, I think given what we know about this administration, we need more ideological balance on that to not really mess it up. Right.
Right. I mean, what do you think that and I would set aside for a second, I mean, the one area where Trump seems to be talking about, or not the Trump, but I mean, so every new article that comes out is something like Trump aides say this, and so every one of these articles needs to be viewed with enormous salt, right? Because one group of Trump aides is saying this, and one group of, and it's this, they're all trying to create sort of fait accompli with respect to these nominees, and you can just see the gears and the knives out behind all of this, trying to figure out who these people are going to be and preempt them in different ways. The one area where it does seem like they kind of have a sense of where they want to go is in defense, and that may be because you need sort of a certain degree of subject matter knowledge to be the Secretary of Defense and Secretary of Navy and so forth, and so that limits the number of people you can go with, and so they have a sense of where they want to go there, and so the people they're talking about there are scary, like Jeff Sessions, but are not sort of outlandishly scary, right, are not cartoonishly scary.
Jeff Sessions, again, somebody you'd rather have at defense than in the AG position, for example.
Right, exactly. Randy Forbes at Navy, a few other people. What do you think the people we've heard of so far have implied in terms of a general thrust of Trump foreign policy, right? I mean, I know that sort of a lot of people in the on the Democratic side who were sketchy about what was thought to be Hillary's hawkishness, are going to be deeply alarmed by the name John Bolton being associated with this administration, right? I mean, basically anybody who said, "Oh, look, if we want a non-interventionist foreign policy, maybe we should think about Trump." It's like, well, okay, now we have the possibility of John Bolton serving in this administration, so this is what you get. What does do you perceive this as an administration where, the essentially the sec state and sec def are going to be running things in terms of, or do you see you have to, right? Let's do our best. Let's do our best. Shrug emoji, right? I guess
Right.
is the so.
I mean, I have no idea, right? And this is the thing that's so unusual, right? We have no idea how this administration is even going to function, right? Trump does not seem to have really the interest or the temperament to run the executive branch. Right. The stories are, but who knows? I mean, as you point out, the stories we're getting have to be parsed in terms of an interscene conflict, right? They have to be, there's this whole thing that I didn't actually understand very well until I worked in government, which was that, a lot of the stories we see in like the Times and the Post or whatever have to be understood often as there's a bureaucratic war going on and somebody is talking to the press to influence public opinion, to influence that bureaucratic war. And that's clearly what's happening within this transition operation. But what we do seem to know is that what's been claimed, right, is that there's not even a clear chain of command between Bannon and Priebus, right? There seems to be some kind of notion that Trump would like his kids to kind of fill in, right? He can't do that because of the ethics laws, right, that are on the books, assuming the Congress doesn't change that. So, what we know is that there's likely to be a big vacuum to fill. And who fills that vacuum is going to be not simply a consequence of the transition, but of internal fighting. And if the worst fears about Trump are true, who's going to best be able to massage his ego? Who's going to be able to get him at the last minute before the decision is made, right? Because he seems to have a tendency to kind of parse whatever was told him last, right? In terms of what he thinks about the world. So we just have no idea. It is clear that it does look like it's shaping up to be. We're going to see a lot of money go into defense. Which is what the Republican Congress wants. Most of the Republican Congress wants. I don't think the Tea Party holdouts are going to hold out on this, and even if they do, they're not going to be enough. So we're going to see a lot of money go into defense. We're going to see this hard power view, right, combined with, this, I think, probably a fairly interventionist view when it comes to countering jihadism or whatever. So a lot of emphasis on hard power. How that plays out is very hard to tell, right? If it plays out in the context of this grand bargain with Russia, it's going to mean something very different than it would, say, in a kind of a Bush restoration administration, where that would have been much more oriented towards the Balts, towards sort of shoring up NATO's defenses. We have no idea what it means for China, right? So the logical thing that I would assume is if things are going to get smoother with Russia, and we're putting a lot of money into the Navy, right, into other kinds of capabilities, that we're going to have to look at Asia as the most likely potential flashpoints, right? And as far as I know, there's nobody in this administration who is particularly dovish on China.
Right. And given sort of the personalized politics that Duterte pursues in the Philippines, right, you can see some sort of cordial relationship between Trump and Duterte that we didn't really have between Obama and Duterte, which would make a difference for Asia as well. And I don't, it is obviously too early to sort of step back and say, what is the impact of this going to be for the international system, right? That's just too big of a question to even grapple right now. But, if you were to offer some really brief advice to sort of major Western leaders, like someone like Merkel, or, even, and not a Western leader, but even someone, say, like Rouhani or something like that, what is the advice you give to major foreign leaders for dealing with this problem, right? For, how do you go about managing the Trump administration if you're Berlin or if you're Paris, although Paris may be Le Pen soon, so who the heck knows, but May or somebody else. What do you say to these people to say, everything's going to be okay, or no, everything's not going to be okay, and then what?
So, again, right, we have the emoji shrug, right? Because, I said this administration, we don't know what this administration is going to look like.
Right.
So we still are, so it would be easier to give this advice in a month or a few weeks than it is now. I think the general advice is, plan for the worst and hope for the best. For NATO allies, and for Merkel in particular, that means, remember, there's a huge amount of inertia, right, in the State Department and in the Department of Defense. We have deeply institutionalized mechanisms of bilateral and multilateral cooperation. And those things are going to often be the path of least resistance for trying to get levers for what you want to do in the world, right? So there are the sort of John Eichenberry's story about institutional opportunities constraints is not 100% wrong, right? There are going to be channeling pressures in any American administration to reinforce those kinds of relationships, say with Japan, for example.
Right.
So the first thing is, don't freak out, right, in terms of taking any precipitous actions or policy positions. But then you have to plan contingently, right? So, Iran. Well, we'll go to Iran in a second. So you have to sort of plan this in a contingent way. What would it mean like if the U.S. really does scale back? And I think for the Germans, unfortunately, from a kind of broader global order perspective, that means returning to their default, which is to kind of make nice with everybody.
Right.
Right. The Germans were always have always been something of an obstacle to U.S. attempts to, I don't know what the right terminology is, be hard line on Russia, for example, have traditionally been put the brakes on that because they have big financial interests because of the Ostpolitik tradition and that sort of thing. Is that good or is that bad? I don't know. It just is, right? But of course, if you're Germany right now, you're worried about the things that happened here and that have been happening all throughout Europe, which is Russian information warfare, destabilizing the regime. And so, I think for the Germans, there's a default foreign policy they can pursue. You assume that American troops aren't leaving anytime soon, right? You assume that NATO is not going away, and you just prepare to ride it out, right? I don't want to, beyond that, I don't know what you think about, and I don't want to speak for the German interests. And for Iran, it's very odd, right? Because this deal is going to be much harder to unwind than I think a lot of Trump supporters realize. It's a weird geostrategic stew, right? Because, and I hate to sort of go on like this, but so on the one hand, you have very clear signals from a Trump administration that they want to make nice with the Russians and strike a new grand bargain, right? On the other hand, you have this antipathy towards everything that Obama did. Right. It means the Iran deal is a terrible, horrible deal, even though it's very clear Trump doesn't have any idea what the Iran deal actually entails. These things are not consistent with one another, right? And they're not consistent with one another for two reasons. One is that Iran is a Russian ally, at least of convenience, in Syria, and is somebody who buys Russian arms. And
maybe buying more Russian arms in the near future. It is a point of contention, but it would be an immediate large point of contention between the United States and Russia.
And the deal, and then on top of it, so not only do you have the sense that this undercuts Russians' geostrategic interests in, to unwind this deal potentially, right? Unless they sort of think it's better to screw up the multilateral stuff with NATO allies and Western European allies, and they can just go on trading with Iran or whatever. But it doesn't look consistent with that. The Russians actually were very supportive ultimately and very helpful in bringing about the deal. That's one of the victories of the reset policy that we tend to forget. The Russians don't particularly want a nuclear-armed Iran. They're not afraid of it as I understand the way they're afraid of, say, the existence of a Pakistani nuclear bomb, but it's not their preferred policy outcome. And then on top of that, right, if the only way that this helps Russia is if it just means chaos in U.S. relations, right? And if you think that's what the Russians really, really want at the end of the day. So there's countervailing pressures there. There's countervailing pressures in Western Europe. There are legal obligations. You have to start a process where you say Iran is in non-compliance. They're not in non-compliance. Now, that could be ginned up for domestic sale pretty easy. We saw that in the Iraq War. Once it's gone, if you were somebody who wanted a more isolationist, like use of forcey foreign policy, that's not what you're going to get. So I don't know.
Yeah, you don't. Again, we come to back to this question, right? That we just don't have any sense. Unspooling the Iran deal seems like such a massive mess of trouble that there doesn't seem to be a ton of indication that Trump wants. Right at this point, he wants to start off his first year with this ton of trouble. Which is not to say there are people in the administration, or people who will find their way into important parts of the administration, who wouldn't think that unspooling all of this mess is a great idea, right? And I don't think, at this point, we can't eliminate the possibility that there are going to be people in this administration who say, oh, hey, look, unspooling the Iran deal is going to cause problems with Russia. Well, that's great, right? That'll undercut this whole Russia thing, right? I mean, the people he's looking at, like you say with Giuliani, right? Giuliani has no specific pro-Russia convictions to the extent he has any convictions at all, right? I mean, Trump's going to be hiring a bunch of people, many of whom, including his vice president, think that resetting with Russia is a terrible idea, right? And so, undertaking the sort of thing that would sort of develop problems with Russia or between Russia and the United States, and even better, right, trying to create some sort of personalistic conflict between Trump and Putin, since both of them again view politics in these very personalistic ways. I think for some of the people who are going to find themselves in this administration, that's going to be fantastic, right? That's going to be win-win, and that's really scary, right? I mean, we're really looking at the prospect of a deeply incoherent policy towards both Russia and Iran. Whereas I think you're right with China. In China, all points seem to be to go in terms of greater antagonism with China. But with Russia and Iran, I think, my goodness, we just don't have any idea what's going to happen yet.
Yeah, it's. I mean, in a sense, we're kind of, we're just kind of riffing here.
Right, exactly. Well, that's fine.
And and so you start spilling out these kinds of possibilities or policy contingencies, and they sound okay, but right. Who the heck knows, right? And that maybe is the greatest threat, right? It's incoherence.
So let's then move on to the to keep up with the riffing metaphor. Let's move on to the bass solo of this particular podcast. So we're talking a lot about the Republican side and the incoherence that's on the Republican side. There seems to be at least some indication that there is going to be a thoroughgoing re-examination of what the loyal opposition on foreign policy looks like. Right, because there is the loyal and disloyal opposition on foreign policy. Because there are now sort of a very wide array of forces in the traditional, not only in the Democratic Party, but also in the traditional foreign policy community that are deeply opposed to Trump. And so, I know that we were both, to some degree, you to a greater degree, me to a lesser, associated with what was trying to be the development of a new progressive foreign policy on the Democratic side. What are your thoughts right now as to, how the Democratic Party is going to approach these sort of dueling questions? One is, coming up with a progressive, coherent answer to Trump's foreign policy, and two, approaching this question of the inclusion of what was the Republican foreign policy machine, but that is now in opposition to Trump, right? What are things going to look like ideologically and in terms of alliance building on opposition to the foreign policy of the Trump administration?
So,
I know those are large questions. So.
Yeah, they're large questions. So let me start at the top, which is to just ask a basic question. or make a statement in the form of that's really a question.
Yeah.
I'll ask this question: do you think in any way, shape, or form this election was really a referendum on foreign policy?
No, absolutely not. No question.
So I understand that there is a lot of impulse among the progressive community to treat it that way, right? And to say we have to really fundamentally rethink things in foreign policy. And from my perspective, that wouldn't be terrible, because I would like there to be a coherent foreign policy, but I don't think we should overreact on the foreign policy side yet, right? And practically what's really going to happen is we're going to see what Trump does. I mean, this is not a should. This is, I think, what really happened, is that there's going to be a lot of uncertainty, as we can see now, about what a Trump foreign policy looks like. And because foreign policy in domestic politics is very reactive, right? The foreign policy that will probably emerge will be kind of out of that reaction. Very specifically, what does that foreign policy look like? What is it doing that we think is wrong? What is it doing that we think is right? And it will adapt to that. Just in the same way, and that's not necessarily healthy, right? Let's go back to the Iraq War, right? So there was a huge impulse among the Democratic side after September 11th, and after 2002 in particular, in the debacle in the midterm elections, to say, we are getting really outmaneuvered. All of the really good ideas are with the neoconservatives. We need to be strong on foreign policy, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm simplifying the story, but you get the Truman Project, you get CNAS, right? You get these this whole impetus to have a really strong, robust, aggressive foreign policy, which makes a lot of sense in the world where the Iraq War goes well. It does not make a lot of sense in a world where Bernie Sanders and Ted Kennedy turned out to be right about the Iraq War, not Hillary Clinton and John Kerry. Right. So we were left with this enormous infrastructure of defense policy and foreign policy premised on an ideological war that kind of collapsed, right? Yeah. But the fact of the matter is, and the fact of the matter is also that the default position of Republicans, we saw this with Pence, right, is always going to be going back to the Democrats are weak on foreign policy, even with their own candidate, right, just running in some ways against GOP foreign policy. So so in that sense, I think we have to be careful on a pragmatic side, but also on an intellectual side. Mm-hmm. But the task is to make sure, on the one hand, that there is a well-developed set of progressive foreign policy principles that's available to draw upon to the extent that it suits the needs of the United States, right, first and foremost, but also that could be drawn upon if Democrats go that way. I'd like them to go that way. I sound very instrumental here.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So that we have to sort of ask the question, what does that mean?
Well, so sort of, I think what you're talking about here, right, is to form a coherent body of sort of foreign policy thinking that could really provide Democrats in 2018, Democrats in 2020, progressives more generally, right? Because I don't want to frame it too much in partisan terms, right? But some sort of strong, coherent intellectual defense of what we might broadly conceive of as progressive principles in international affairs, right? That whether or not this forms the sort of the core ideological opposition to Trump is nevertheless there and has a voice in the formulation of the next administration's foreign policy.
And let me just start back on the politics to this question, substantially what's good. We do need to develop a coherent progressive foreign policy vision for two reasons. One is that it's a better foreign policy vision. It would be nice if the Democrats were to take it, right? And it might help with some of these struggles between the center left and the far left in the Democratic Party, right? Secondly, because it's not looking good from my perspective, but it is possible that there will be aspects of Trump foreign policy that are in some ways compatible with progressive vision, but that we need to be organized to push on to be able to do our part to push down the negatives, right, to dampen down the negatives and the negative externalities, right? So, for example, if it is really the case that a Trump administration is going to try to strike a grand bargain with Russians, from a progressive standpoint, we really do not want a lot of frictions with Russia, right? From the United States perspective, there are not a lot of core security gains to be had from fighting a new Cold War, right?
Right.
But from a progressive foreign policy perspective, and this is a question we'll probably come back to maybe because you think there's less consensus on this than I hope there is. Mm-hmm. We have to be committed to American commitments in liberal institutions, right? NATO has been a tremendous asset to the United States and to the globe in terms of enhancing our security, diminishing our need to double down on militarized defense policies. I mean, this is counterfactual. You could say we're very militarized, but it would be even worse, right, if Europe were unstable. And it's also a huge benefit to the European project, right, whatever form that takes, right. It's been a tremendous resource for us, and it's a commitment we've made, right. And so the question is, if you are going to strike a grand bargain with Russia, or something that looks like something that does something the recent ever did, which is get at fundamental conflicts, right, in U.S.-Russian relations, that cannot be done at the expense of existing NATO partners, right? Cannot give Russia a free hand to meddle in the Baltic states, right? We can debate, I think, quite fruitfully whether or not the NATO should have ever expanded as far as it did, but it has.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so now we've got to live with that reality, right? So, the security of those NATO partners has to be part of that deal, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that we have to continue with the Bucharest Pledge, right? Which, I mean, I've written about, I think was a really bad idea,
mm-hmm.
right? I have a piece in an edited volume about.
Can you remind us what the Bucharest Pledge was?
So that was so in the under the Bush administration, right? When basically we could back up. Russia thought they were going to get a grand bargain under Bush. They thought it was going to be counterterrorism.
They've thought they're going to be a grand bargain. I mean, really, if you read Limits of Partnership, right? I mean, it's reset after reset after reset. And in some sense, you can even think of 2016 as the same way, right? Just another effort at reset that might look like all the other previous efforts.
So they were convinced that the U.S. had woken up after 9/11 and there was going to be a genuine partnership, right? For a variety of reasons, it wasn't just that the Bush administration proactively did things to anger the Russians, which they did. They also, frankly, just ignored the Russians, which if you're a country and a leadership very concerned with great power status, isn't something that goes over well, right? In the Bush administration, particularly the wing within it that we might call neoconservative, was, of course, very infatuated with the Keller revolutions, right, and with democracy building consolidation in the former Soviet Union. And there are lots of good things about that, right? But the Russians very much viewed it as a threat, not only to their sphere of influence, what they consider to be their privileged sphere of influence, right, but they also viewed it as a threat to the regime, right? And even if they did not, it is the default position in Russia to consolidate your authority by dismissing your opposition as tools of the West and demonizing the West. So all these things kind of came together.
Right.
But the Bush administration had, by 2008 roughly, had Iraq was going down the tubes, right? And the freedom agenda was not looking so good, right? The centerpiece of the Bush administration, the enlargement of freedom. There was one success story and one partial success story in this agenda, and it was the success story was Georgia under Saakashvili. And I say success story in scare quotes, right? But it was more democratic. We saw significant backsliding, but it was more democratic and less corrupt than it had been, right? And was very much a country that wanted to be in the Western fold, wanted to be in NATO, wanted to be in the EU, wanted to be the Israel of the Caucasus for the United States, and Ukraine, right? Although you could argue that the Europeans were even more instrumental in the Orange Revolution than the United States was. So Bush went to the Bucharest NATO summit to press for a NATO membership action plan or map for Georgia and Ukraine. And the Germans and the Russians, if I remember correctly, were having none of this, right? Saw it as unnecessarily antagonistic. They had good trade relations with the Russians, thought it would be a mistake to extend NATO to countries that were huge risks of entrapment, right? I mean, Georgia...
that were indefensible, that had massive internal contradictions, right? That a whole variety of different problems.
Right,
really.
and Georgia, had territory that was controlled by Russian puppets, right? And that Cyprus really wanted that, right? So it's an entrapment risk. It could draw us into conflicts that we don't want to be drawn into, that don't serve our security interests. And so Bush essentially got a compromise, which was that he didn't get the membership action plan, but he did get a commitment for the idea that these countries would eventually be able to enter NATO. And some people think that this was one of the inflection points that ultimately led to the Georgia-Russia conflict in 2008, right? Yes. I'm getting my dates a little bit off here, but yeah, the 2008 August War. In response to Crimea, NATO had, despite the Obama administration actually being very cool to this stuff, right, and very distrustful very worried about entrapment risks, and being criticized by McCain and Graham, those sort of pro-Georgia elements, for example. The Crimea crisis really convinced the Obama administration to reopen that door a bit more. I mean, nobody believes the countries are ever going to be in NATO, right? But to reopen that door, in part out of leverage, in part out of punishment, in part out of coercion, is part of the package of stuff, in part because reassurance of the Baltics is related, and in Poland, to a lesser degree, is related to policies in Ukraine and Georgia. And so that's something that there could be a deal about, right? Whether that's a deal that would hold is another question, because, you can make a deal that says we won't let Georgia into NATO, but you stop messing with Georgia, and the chances of the Russians keeping that over the long haul are pretty slim. But, we can debate how much of a security interest the U.S. has in Georgia. I don't think we have any real security interest in Georgia. I do think we have some moral and ethical issues to support Georgian democracy, but we don't have a security interest there.
Right. I think it's a struggle. I mean, just to sort of step back for a second, I suspect that within this effort to construct or think through a new approach to, or a new sort of coherent progressive approach, this question of the role of the United States in building and maintaining these kinds of security and international institutions is going to come up over and over again, right? And it's going to come up over and over again, in part because there are genuine differences about this, right? I mean, the security architecture and the economic architecture that the United States has, which people like you and I, broadly speaking, think is a good thing, is also an architecture which benefits the United States in a whole bunch of ways, and we think it's important to benefit the United States in a whole bunch of ways. But other people, sort of within our very broad coalition, are suspicious about that, right? And they are they're suspicious about that, and they're suspicious about this broader sort of liberal internationalist / hegemonic project, right? And this is also an area of sort of specific cleavage where the way that Trump thinks about foreign policy sort of gets at this cleavage in a really important way, right? Because in some sense, Trump's approach to foreign policy sort of mirrors this skepticism about the liberal internationalist order that you find among some within the progressive community.
And I mean, so there's one aspect of this, which is the importance of developing a robust progressive foreign policy, right, is to be able to articulate necessity is a strong word, the importance of these kinds of relationships, right? There's this line about the U.S. about dollarization, right? And the position of the U.S. dollar is creating exorbitant privilege for the United States, and that's also true of our alliance structure, right? The United States reaps enormous benefits in terms of its diplomatic capacity, its coercive capacity, its security from having this enormous network of alliances. It's what the Russians don't have. It's what the Chinese are trying to build. It really is what makes us different, right? And what makes us different is that a lot of those alliances, even though NATO was originally actually pretty asymmetric and not as multilateral, warm, fuzzy as it became later, the original Japanese security bargain was basically imperial, right? Over time, the U.S. has renegotiated these to be much more equitable, right? And that's also something very unusual about the United States, right? For all of its faults, right? The NATO Status Forces Agreement is the gold standard agreement for what countries are giving up in terms of sovereignty to have U.S. basing there, which is not as much as traditionally you would give up.
Right, and it's carefully negotiated on both sides, right? And there is an understanding, as you suggest, that there's a two-way street here.
So we can educate. So we can argue that this is really very beneficial in the United States. It's very beneficial to the world, right? And I had this argument the other day with somebody where I said, well, what is NATO? What is it good for? It's just U.S. imposition. And I'm like, imagine Europe without NATO. And they're like, well, and I said, well, Europe without NATO is the Europe of the last few centuries, right? Particularly as the EU project looks like it's fraying, right? And I'm one of those people who actually thinks that the EU project is much more dependent upon U.S. security guarantees than people realize, right? And damping down the possibility of security dilemmas between Germany and France and the UK and everybody else, right? So we can make an argument that this is a global good, and it's also very good for the United States. And there are people they're academics who are now really focused on this question. What are the costs and benefits? But a lot of the evidence seems to suggest there are people who disagree that there are actually strong benefits in terms of trade, in terms of wealth generation for the United States of being in these relationships, both as externalities from the enhanced sort of security in these countries, but also in terms of this web of diplomacy that we have, right? In this web of mechanisms for negotiating various issues and for having good relations. So we can educate people about that, and the key is that the left, who sees this as hegemonist, right, are suspicious of this as essentially an excuse for U.S. coercion, for encircling our adversaries like Russia, for using this to engage in out-of-area conflicts, which we've done in Libya. And I think the answer, in part, is that we probably actually do more of these things if it weren't for NATO. But the other answer is to ping it to aggressive foreign policy that says, no, the point of these is multilateral security communities, right? It's not just a platform. So it's not just a stationary aircraft carrier for the United States.
Right. And so to reinforce that the nature of these institutions is malleable, the nature of these institutions and these relationships depends to a great extent on how the United States is approaching them. And the United States will approach them in different ways depending on how the United States thinks about how serious how the United States and how United States policymakers conceive of the value of these institutions, right? Whether sort of in a very specific national interest way or sort of a broader understanding of what these institutions should look like. Unfortunately, we have reached the extent of the time we can spend today. So let's do this again sometime soon and revisit some of these questions. And Dan, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you. I wish I hadn't talked so long and that we'd gotten on to other things.
Oh, it's quite, yeah, we can do as many of these as we want. So let's have another one of these sometime. So,
okay, bye.